Hi, my name is Brooke Rakowski, and I did my presentation on Dennis Rader, also known as BTK, or Bind, Torture, Kill. His full name is Dennis Lynn Rader. He was born on March 9th, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas. His parents are William and Dorothy Rader, and they live in Wichita. Rader was not known to suffer serious abuse or neglect, but claimed to have very little attention from either of his parents. Rader once stated that he loved his mother, but that the grudge against her for being so aloof. He also claimed his female school teachers ridiculed him, but there is no apparent single traumatic event in his life that would have warped his mind. Rader found enjoyment in torturing animals, especially cats. He attempted to go to college, but dropped out and joined the U.S. Air Force. With the military behind him, he got married to Paula Dietz. He worked various jobs as an electrician and at an outdoor supply company. In 1974, Rader took a job working for ADT Security Services. Shortly after, in 1997, he graduated from Wichita State University with a degree in criminal justice. He eventually became a compliance officer in Park City, Kansas. This is a photo with Dennis Rader on the left, alongside of his 10 victims. The Otero family consists of the first 4 victims, followed by Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicki Wedgerly, and Dolores Davis. January 15, 1974 is the day Dennis Rader committed his first murders of the many yet to come. He went to the Otero's home and cut the phone lines and waited by the back door. Rader thought that only Miss Otero and her 2 children, Josephine and Joseph Jr., were home and did not expect Mr. Otero to be there. He entered the family's home when Jr. opened the door and let the dog inside. Once he was inside, he confronted the family with a pistol. One of the kids was forced to put their dog outside. He then moved the family into the bedroom and tied their wrists and ankles. Rader tried to keep them comfortable by loosening the binds a few times until he realized that the family could identify him because they could see him since he was not wearing any type of mask. That's when he decided to kill them all. He went after Mr. Otero first and put a plastic bag over his head and tightened it with cords around his neck. Then he went to strangle both Mrs. Otero and Josephine until they passed out. At this point, Mr. Otero broke a hole into the plastic bag that was around his head from flailing around. So Rader layered cloth like a t-shirt and then another plastic bag over top of his head and retightened the cords. And then he went to go do the same thing to Junior, but then Mrs. Otero woke up and begged for her son's life. So he took Junior to another room and did the exact same thing he did to Mr. Otero. When he came back in, he re-strangled Mrs. Otero, and then Josephine woke up because she was laying on the bed passed out next to Mrs. Otero. So then she woke up and Rader took Josephine down into the basement and hung her. And after she was officially dead, he masturbated to her hanging body before taking his things that he brought with him, along with one of the family's radios and Mr. Otero's watches. He left, and then the eldest son from the family came home and found bodies there, and that's how they discovered the first scene. Rader's next murder was less than 3 months later on April 4th. His next victim was Catherine Bright. She was a project him, which meant that she was one of the many people that he watched, but she was randomly selected from his projects. He stealthily entered her house through the back door and waited for her to return home. Unexpectedly, her brother Kevin Bright was with her. He confronted both of them with a pistol and tied both of their wrists and ankles. He separated them into separate rooms and then went to go strangle Catherine's brother first. He broke out of his restraints and had a fight with Rader, and Rader shot him in the head and then went to go strangle Catherine. But then he heard Kevin moving Kevin got shot again when he was fleeing the scene. So Rader went back to Catherine to finish the job and stabbed her 2 to 3 times up underneath of her ribs. He proceeded to gather his things and left, but he was not wearing a mask again. So, it makes me wonder why he was never identified by Kevin Bright, since he survived both gunshot wounds that night. So why he never came forward, or not getting questioned, or what happened in that situation. Rader's next murder was almost 3 years later, on March 17, 1977. The victim, Shirley Bean, was selected completely randomly. He followed a little boy and watched what house he went into, and then he went up to the door and knocked, and he told the little boy he was a detective from the police department, and slightly pushed his way into the house so he was inside. And then he had the pistol with him, and he explained to Shirley, the victim, that he had a problem with sexual fantasies and we need to tie her up. He locked the children into the bathroom with toys and supplies and pushed the bed up against the door so they couldn't get out and see what was going on, which I think was very considerate on his behalf for the children's sake, but why does he care if he's going to these extents anyway? So after the kids were barricaded into the bathroom, she was tied up at her wrists and ankles, and Rader put a bag over her head and strangled her with rope. He proceeded to grab his things and leave, just like every other murder so far. Ten months later, Rader killed again. On December 8th, Nancy Fox was murdered. She was another one of his projects. He learned her name by snooping through her mailbox. He also followed her to work. He saw her car outside of her house on that night, so he knocked on the door. After no answer, he cut the phone lines and broke into her home and waited for her to return. Once she came home, he confronted her and then proceeded to handcuff her and tie her feet. Rader got on top of her, half-dressed, and strangled her with a belt. He masturbated to her body before leaving the scene with his things. Rader's next murder didn't occur for another 8 years. It was April 27, 1985, when Maureen Hedge was killed. She was his neighbor that turned into one of his projects. She only lived down the street, but he took a taxi most of the way there from where he parked his car, and then he walked the rest of the way. He snuck into her house because she wasn't there when he got there, but when she returned home, she was with mail company that didn't leave for about an hour. But Rader still waited until hours later into the early morning to strangle her with his bare hands. He stripped off her clothes and tied her up and placed her in her own trunk of her car. He then drove them both to his church and took Polaroid pictures of her body in various poses, and then he disposed of her body in the ditch by the side of the road. Over a year later, Rader killed Vicki Wergerly on September 16th. She was also one of his projects. To gain entry to her home, he pretended to be a telephone repairman, so she willingly let him into her house. And when she wasn't looking, he pulled his pistol and asked to go into the bedroom with her. He then tied her hands and feet, but she ended up breaking the binds and fought with him until he strangled her with pantyhose. He took pictures of her after rearranging her clothes, and he quickly left. Paramedics later arrived to her house. I don't know how they were called. I did not find that in my research, but they arrived to their house and she wasn't quite dead yet, but she did die later that day as a result of the strangulation. I feel as though if Rader knew that she wasn't completely dead, he would have gone to more extreme measures to ensure that the job was done. Just like in the first murders when the Mrs. Otero and Josephine were strangled and they just passed out because it wasn't enough pressure, enough force, or it wasn't done the correct way to kill somebody. I feel like if he he would have realized that, he would have went back to ensure that the job was done properly. Rader's 10th and final victim was Dolores Davis, who was killed on January 19th, 1991. He previously cased her home multiple different times and couldn't figure out a way to get inside. So when he finally decided to act upon his desires and go kill Dolores, he broke a window with a concrete block, which obviously she heard the noise and came out of her bedroom to see what was going on. Radar confronted her and ended up handcuffing her to make sure that she would stay in the house, but he also wanted to make sure that he had a getaway car from the scene, so he wanted to make sure that the keys were there and the car were there and that they worked together. So once he did that, he came back and removed her handcuffs, only to strangle her with pantyhose. But unlike most of the other murders he had, he didn't just leave the scene. He took the body other places and took pictures of it, and he even disposed of this body underneath of a bridge instead, in blankets, instead of leaving it at the scene. So I was wondering what would go through his head to cause such a change to his routine that he has pretty much set with every murder. All of these cases went cold. For the 30th anniversary of the Otero family murder, the local paper featured an article about the case and speculated that the murderer was either caught or dead. Rader made the stupid decision to respond by sending evidence from his 9th murder, Vicki Werderly's. He sent Vicki Werderly's driver's license and photos of her body to the reporter. And then for the next year or so, he sent packages to the media and or left them around town to be found by police officials. But his packages were often cereal boxes that normally held drawings, crime souvenirs, photographs, written descriptions of murders, and dolls posed as the victims. In 2005, police received a cereal box with a note asking if a floppy disk was traceable. And the police replied that it was not traceable through a classified ad in the newspaper, even though it was, seeing it just to try to see if the killer would be stupid enough to turn himself in like that. So Rader did send the disc in, and then they traced it back to Rader's church, where he was president of the congregation. And then because he was already a suspect at this point because of all the connections, they were also able to notice his car in multiple places where they dropped off the packages. And then what cemented the case the most was DNA from his daughter. His daughter gave DNA and DNA genetics. They were able to kind of trace it back to Rader's DNA and compare it to the DNA that was found at crime scenes where he masturbated at the bodies at the end of his killing. So the DNA matched the semen from at the first crime scene. And then he was arrested in February 2005, and he was still shocked the police had lied to him about the traceability of a floppy disk. He confessed to his crimes and pled guilty in June 2005, which I'm not too surprised about, because the fact that he was able to gloat about his killings and send evidence to the police and all the extreme measures that he went to show off his killings, I'm not surprised that he wanted to get credit for his killings. Being guilty for it, undoubtedly, you know what I mean? If you plead guilty, you're undoubtedly guilty for it. So I feel like he did that just to show hey, I did this, I'm proud of this, this is me, and you can't really change it. So after his guilty plea, he was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms. So he will be behind bars the rest of his life, which I think is very justified considering he killed 10 people premeditatively, and these people had like no idea, there was no reason for any of this. And these are the sources I got my information from. The YouTube link is a video of his entire